And welcome back to Hannity. Now, this past weekend, just 1 week after George Zimmerman's acquittal, thousands of protesters gathered in dozens of cities in what NBC News host Al Sharpton was calling the National Day of Action for Trayvon Martin. Now, organizers of the events claimed that they were trying to pressure the Justice Department into filing civil rights charges against Zimmerman, but we have evidence that at least some of these demonstrations were much more than that. The video you're about to see comes to us from the National Review Online, was taken right here in New York City, and it proves that liberal political forces were in fact driving these events. Watch what happens when protesters apparently spotted our very own Geraldo Rivera fully clothed in the crowd.
To present our leader, the one who sent the simple and pitiful voice in many struggles.
There's a reason why we're in this There's a reason why we're in this
on behalf of the downtrodden of the country today. We call for 100 cities.
Get Fox out!
Get Fox out. That's not all. Brandon Darby of Breitbart News was verbally assaulted by the protesters in Houston. All of that caught on tape.
Shame on you. Shame on you, you dumb as a you are despicable human.
Put it back. You too, sir. Let's go. Let's go. Keep it going.
Okay, pretty unbelievable. Joining me now with reaction from Breitbart News, Joel Pollak, and Democratic strategist Tara Dowdell is back with us. Good to see you both.
Good to see you.
Your reaction to some of the rhetoric that was used, because a lot of it was over the top this weekend, and predictably so. I said it was going to happen. What is your reaction to that?
Well, Sean, do some people show up at protests with their own agenda? Absolutely. That happens all the time. There was a pro-Zimmerman rally in Texas where a woman showed up with a sign that said racist and proud, and that was on the in the newspaper today. So certainly there are people who show up who behave badly at protests, and that's not something you can really control for. But the bulk of people there are genuinely concerned. And one thing I feel that's getting totally overlooked and missed in this argument is that black people are hurt by this decision. We are literally hurt. And so this is not about scoring political points. This is about us feeling like we are once again not as important, that our lives don't have value. That is the legitimate
Do you really believe that's what,
in our
do you really believe that's what this case is about? Because you had an eyewitness, you had injuries to George Zimmerman, an eyewitness that put Trayvon on top of him, and the law for justification of use of force. There was no other decision here. None that the jury could make.
I think had they filed different charges, we might have had a different outcome.
Justification of force would have held, though.
But the reality is, if you look at Zimmerman, I mean, he's had 2 domestic violence complaints against him, protective orders.
Well, you want to bring up Trayvon's past?
Assaulting a police officer.
Wait a minute. What about Trayvon's past? Do you want to bring up his school records and all this? Go ahead, Joe.
I think that some of the intolerance we saw at the protest was because the intolerance was, in a sense, under the foundations of the protests. You're talking about, I think, respectfully, a perversion of civil rights. A defendant was found not guilty, George Zimmerman, and yet the entire forces of the federal government, the FBI, the Department of Justice, are arrayed now against him to try to find some excuse to try him a second time on civil rights violations that we know didn't happen, that the FBI already investigated didn't happen. And what really frightens me is to see a man who was acquitted, whether you agree with what he did or not, gotten out of the car, should have followed Trayvon, whatever. All of that is immaterial. We have a person who's being scapegoated for all of these other grievances, which may be legitimate, but whose civil rights are now being violated. He can't walk anywhere. He's got to wear a bulletproof vest, and he's the target of these nationwide protests, which unfortunately President Obama fed into. So I think that part of the intolerance is because the very purpose of these protests is intolerant. It's basically saying we're not accepting the results of the court's
But he's still alive. Unlike Trayvon Martin, he's still alive, so I think he's far better off. And the reality is, I understand your point but look at other things that have happened. In the Rodney King situation, George Herbert Walker Bush had the Justice Department look into it. So this is not unprecedented. And people have a right to rally in this country. Since when are we not allowed to rally? So you're upset that people are rallying?
No one's saying that.
That sounds like a double standard to me.
There were 2 very different reactions if you want to go down the past. And you say the black community is hurt by this verdict, even though I don't see legally any other verdict. And I think it's a tragedy. I want to be very clear, and I've said it many times. What do you make of the different reactions along racial lines for the OJ verdict? What do you make of that? What do you make of that?
Well, I think I was kind of young at that time, so
But you know, if you're talking about Rodney King, you know about O.J. Simpson, and the black community responded overwhelmingly one way. and people were outraged at the way the black community reacted to that.
Well, there was a belief that O.J. Simpson was not guilty. I don't share that belief. I believe if you, just like Zimmerman, I believe if you can hit a woman, you can kill a person. Any man that will put his hands on a woman can do a lot worse, and that's why I believe O.J. did it, and that's why I believe George Zimmerman acted with some malicious intent.
You talk more broadly about the black community's feelings about this.
Right.
But overwhelmingly, there was a reaction in the black community when the O.J. verdict came in, right?
And people were outraged, and you know what happened? People brought a wrongful death suit against O.J. Simpson.
But do you get the point I'm making?
And they had that right.
I think so. You know, and I've been to NAACP meetings. I went to the 2011 convention. One of the most important issues for the NAACP was the right of criminal defendants and not seeing young men from minority groups railroaded through the criminal justice system. Well, what's happened to George Zimmerman? He got railroaded through a criminal justice system. There was no probable cause to arrest him and charge him, but because of political pressure, he was pushed into that situation. He was acquitted, and they still won't let him go. And I think what's really ironic is that in any other situation, if the person who had died had been white, I would wager, there'd be outrage at the way a member of minority, George Zimmerman, from mixed background, was being railroaded through to satisfy, in a sense, a mob of vigilantes demanding justice and so forth.
A mob, vigilante.
Absolutely. This is mob justice.
There's a legal question.
I think the civil rights are being
Is there any evidence, because there's a mountain of evidence that I think is exculpatory for George Zimmerman in terms of him not being racist, tutoring minority children, standing up for a black homeless man against the Sanford Police Department, taking a black woman to the prom. That does not seem to me to be the actions of a racist. Any evidence in this case that shows any racial animus in your position?
I believe racism can be situational. I believe you can be in a situation and you can prejudge a person based on their racial background.
What evidence in this case?
The evidence is that people said, some of his neighbors confirmed that he had made a lot of comments about young black men coming into the neighborhood and doing all these terrible things. And so I think racism can be situational. Now, with respect to the point that you were making earlier about this case, I think that, again, the African-American community has not just had specific reactions about this, but there was an incident in my home state of New Jersey where Jewish synagogues were being defaced, and black ministers came to the defense of the Jewish community. I want to cite another example. When the Mexican man was beaten by black teenagers, the black community stood with the Mexican-American community in this country to say that was wrong and participated in those rallies. So it is unfair for you to act as if we're just standing up in this situation,
let me ask,
and you don't have all the information and the facts.
Where are the protesters? I have a list here of names of Chicago kids killed.
Tragic.
Tragic. We don't. Do you
Awful.
Know, nobody knows any of their names.
And that's a shame.
Now, I've been listing them on my radio show. I did it all last week, but it is a shame. Where are those protesters in Chicago, and why not? Because that makes me think that this Zimmerman case is selective and political. Joel.
You know, I'm from Chicago, and I wish that we had the kind of nationwide protests you had for this case to improve conditions in the black community, to talk about education reform.
Is it selective moral outrage?
It absolutely is, and it's done by politicians and by leaders who want to get people ginned up against each other. You know, this is community organizing 101. You create outrage, you create conflict, and then you get people to follow you.
You got to roll. Thank you both. Good to see you both.